At 6:30 on a Thursday morning, my mother called me laughing. Not worried, not confused, laughing. "Your sister finally got what she wanted," she said. "Your husband left." I was standing in my kitchen with a mug in my hand. Daniel, my husband of 11 years, was sitting across from me in the sweatshirt he'd slept in. My mother continued before I could answer. "She told us he moved out last night. Don't embarrass yourself by calling him and begging." Then my father came onto the call. "Try not to make this worse, Claire. Just let him go." I put them on speaker. Daniel looked at me, then at the phone. "You two really need to see what she sent me last night." The line went silent. That was the first crack in the story, because Daniel had not left me. He was sitting 3 feet away, and my sister had apparently given my entire family a completely different version of my marriage. If you've ever had people decide what happened to you before asking you, stay with me. And if you've ever felt like the difficult one in your family simply because you spoke up, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps these stories reach people who understand that feeling. And tell me where you're listening from. I always love knowing how far one story can travel. My name is Claire. I'm 38, married, and a mother of 2. For most of my life, my role in my family had been simple. I was the dependable daughter, the one who handled things, the one who didn't need much. My younger sister Sophie was different. If Sophie was upset, everyone adjusted. If Sophie made a mistake, there was always a reason. If I was hurt, there was usually a reminder that I was too sensitive. My mother had said those words so many times that I eventually started believing them. Maybe I really did overreact. Maybe I really was difficult. Maybe everyone else saw something about me that I couldn't. Sophie knew that doubt existed inside me, and she knew exactly how to use it. 15 years earlier, after our grandmother died, Sophie had told me something that changed the way I saw myself. She said Grandma had been disappointed in me. She said she had been ashamed of who I'd become. I was young, grieving, and completely shattered. Then someone took a photograph of me breaking down. My family remembered the photograph. Nobody remembered what had been said before it. For 15 years, that image followed me. Whenever I disagreed with my mother, someone brought it up. Whenever I defended myself, I was reminded of how I'd behaved at Grandma's funeral. I never knew that one day my sister would use the same kind of trick again. Only this time, she wasn't trying to make me look difficult. She was trying to make everyone believe my marriage had already ended. And that Thursday morning, my husband was sitting beside me with the proof on his phone. Daniel and I had been married for 11 years. We had 2 children, Lily and Ben, a modest house, and a life that wasn't exciting enough for gossip, but was good enough for us. Daniel worked as a school counselor. He was patient, quiet, and uncomfortable with family arguments. I was a freelance photographer. My work had taught me to notice small things. A forced smile. A nervous glance. Someone turning their body away from a person they claimed to trust. I noticed small things in my family, too. For years, Sophie had been treated like the fragile one. I remember my mother's birthday dinner a couple of years earlier. I'd arranged the reservation, ordered the cake, organized the gift, and picked everyone up. Sophie arrived late carrying a box of chocolates. My mother stood immediately and hugged her. "Oh, sweetheart." Sophie smiled and accepted the praise. Later, she casually told me she'd mentioned the dinner to Mom. She didn't say she'd planned it. She simply let Mom believe she had. I told her it bothered me. My mother overheard. "Claire, why can't you just let her have this?" I wasn't trying to start a fight, but somehow I became the problem. That was the pattern. I learned to measure my words before speaking. Then came the strange messages. Aunt Linda called me one afternoon. "Claire, if you need anything, I'm here." I laughed. "Need anything for what?" She hesitated. "Oh, nothing. Just take care of yourself." 2 days later, my cousin Megan texted me. "Thinking about you. Hope you're okay." I stared at the message. Nothing was wrong. Daniel and I were fine. The kids were fine. But suddenly people were looking at me differently. A woman from my parents' church even stopped me at the grocery store. She squeezed my arm and said, "Your sister is really trying to keep everyone together." "Together from what?" I asked. Her expression changed. "Oh, you know, family things." I went home unsettled. That night, I asked Daniel if he was unhappy with our marriage. He looked genuinely confused. Where is this coming from? I told him about the strange comments. He hugged me and said my family had always been strange about me. What he didn't tell me was that Sophie had already been contacting him. At first, her messages seemed harmless. She asked how he was doing. She suggested they talk sometime. She said she was worried about me. Daniel ignored her. He thought telling me would create unnecessary drama. But the messages continued. Then the night before my mother's phone call, Sophie sent him a photograph. And beneath it was a message that made him finally realize this wasn't innocent. He didn't know how I'd react when I saw it. Neither did I. If you think you know what the photograph showed, hold that thought. Because the picture was convincing. Enough to make my entire family believe a marriage was over. But it wasn't the picture itself that frightened me. It was the story attached to it. Daniel unlocked his phone and handed it to me. The photograph showed him standing beside Sophie at a restaurant. Her shoulder was pressed against his. The lighting was warm. They looked close. Too close. For one terrible second, my stomach dropped. Then I looked again. Daniel wasn't smiling. His body was angled away from her. And something about the photograph felt wrong. Not fake. Edited by circumstance. The frame showed only them. It didn't show the rest of the room. I scrolled down. Sophie had written that Daniel was unhappy. She said he'd told her our marriage was falling apart. She said he deserved someone who truly understood him. Daniel looked at me. I never told her any of that. I know. You believe me? I know you. Then I saw another message. Sophie had sent Daniel a screenshot from a family conversation. She appeared to be using it as proof that everyone already knew we were having problems. But at the top of the screenshot, part of another message was visible. Only a few words. Tell Claire the worried version. I stopped scrolling. I read it again. The worried version, not the truth. A version. That was the moment something inside me became very still. I called my cousin Megan. Has Sophie contacted you? There was a pause. Yes. What did she say? She said you and Daniel were having serious problems. Did she say when? Not exactly. That answer mattered. I started asking other relatives. The details were different every time. To one person, Sophie said she was protecting me. To another, she said she was protecting Daniel. To someone else, she said she was simply worried. But the basic story was always the same. My marriage was supposedly collapsing, and Sophie was somehow the person standing in the middle of it. I opened the notes app on my phone and began writing down dates. The church dinner, the strange phone calls, the messages, the photograph, the things my mother had said. Soon I noticed a pattern. The sympathy had started before the photograph ever existed. That meant the photograph wasn't the beginning. It was evidence created for a story people had already been prepared to believe. I looked at Daniel. Why didn't you tell me about the earlier messages? He rubbed his face. I thought ignoring her would make it disappear. I understood. But I also knew silence had given Sophie room. That night I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about Grandma's photograph from 15 years earlier. A picture had been enough to define me back then. Now another carefully chosen picture was being used to define my marriage. Maybe that was why the new photograph bothered me so much. It wasn't simply a lie. It was a familiar method. And if I was right, Sophie hadn't suddenly become cruel. She had simply become better at hiding what she was doing. Before I confronted anyone, I needed to know how far the story had traveled. More importantly, I needed to know who had helped carry it. Because my mother had called me that morning with absolute confidence. She hadn't asked whether Daniel had left. She already believed it, and that meant someone had convinced her long before she called me. I went to my mother's house 3 days later. I didn't tell her what I had discovered. She made coffee and acted as though nothing unusual had happened. I sat across from her. Mom, when did you first hear Daniel and I were having problems? She stirred her coffee. People had concerns. Who? She looked at me. Claire, it doesn't matter. It matters to me. She sighed. You've always been very intense about these things. The old sentence. Too sensitive. I felt the familiar urge to apologize. I didn't. Did Sophie tell you? My mother's eyes moved toward the window. She was worried about you. That wasn't my question. She didn't answer. I finished my coffee and left. Outside, I noticed something on the passenger seat of her car. A church event schedule. The date was the same weekend when people had started treating me differently. I photographed it. Then I drove to see my Uncle Frank. We talked for nearly an hour. Near the end, he casually said, "Your mother called us about you weeks ago." I looked at him. When? Early March. I knew the date. It was before the church dinner, before the messages, before Sophie had supposedly discovered anything. My mother hadn't been reacting to a rumor. She had been preparing people for one. I drove home feeling strangely calm. That was the moment I stopped asking how to prove myself. I started asking why I was still trying. Daniel wanted to confront everyone immediately. "We can show them everything," he said. "I know." "Then let's do it." I shook my head. "A private confrontation won't work." He understood what I meant. My family had always been able to turn private. Conversations into competing versions of events. If I became emotional, that would become the story. If I raised my voice, that would become the story. If I cried, that would become the story. I needed something different. I needed the truth to stand on its own. So I started organizing everything. The old photograph. The new photograph. The messages. The dates. The screenshot. The names of people Sophie had contacted. I wasn't building a revenge file. I was building a timeline. There is a difference. A revenge file is designed to hurt someone. A timeline is designed to make lying harder. That night, my daughter Lily came downstairs for water. She saw the papers spread across the table. "Are you and Aunt Sophie fighting?" I thought about giving her a simple answer. Instead, I said, "She told people something about our family that wasn't true. Are you going to make her sorry?" "No." "Then what are you doing?" I looked at my daughter. "I'm telling the truth." She nodded. "Because people should know?" "Yes." She went upstairs. I stayed at the table. Then my phone rang. It was Megan. "Claire," she said quietly. "There's something I've never told you." My heart tightened. "What?" "I was there at Grandma's funeral. I already knew she'd been there. But I saw Sophie talking to you." I sat down. "What did she say?" "I couldn't hear every word." Megan paused. "But I remember what happened immediately afterward." I held my breath. She already had her phone in her hand. And suddenly, the past I had spent 15 years trying to forget was becoming part of the evidence, too. Megan and I met at a small cafe the next morning. She looked nervous before she even sat down. "I should have told you years ago," she said. "What happened?" She explained that she had been standing near the window at Grandma's funeral. She saw Sophie approach me. She saw us talking. She saw me become upset. And then she noticed Sophie holding her phone before I stepped backward and the photograph was taken. Megan didn't claim to know every word Sophie had said. She didn't pretend she had proof of everything. She only remembered what she had seen. That was enough. For 15 years, I'd believed the photograph had simply captured the worst moment of my life. Now I knew there had been something before the camera clicked. I asked Megan why she'd stayed quiet. She looked down. "I was young. Your mother was already angry. Sophie was everyone's favorite. I thought maybe I'd misunderstood. I understood that more than she knew. In my family, silence was often presented as kindness. Don't upset Mom. Don't make Sophie feel worse. Don't bring up the past. Don't create drama." And eventually, everyone becomes so afraid of conflict that the person who tells the truth becomes the problem. Megan agreed to come to the family gathering with me. I didn't tell anyone else what I planned. The gathering was supposed to celebrate Sophie. There would be relatives, church friends, and several people who had already heard her version of my marriage. I prepared my evidence carefully. First, the new photograph, then the original, then the messages, then the timeline. Finally, Megan. I wasn't planning to scream. I wasn't going to insult Sophie. I didn't want to humiliate anyone. I simply wanted to stop allowing other people to tell my story for me. Before leaving, Daniel stood beside me. "I wish I could take this from you." "You can't." I know, but you can stand beside me. He nodded. That was all I needed. On the way to the gathering, I realized something. For years, I had thought quiet meant weak. I thought if I didn't fight loudly enough, people would assume I had lost. But quiet can also mean controlled. It can mean you've stopped reacting and started choosing. That night, I wasn't walking into the room hoping my family would finally love me correctly. I wasn't even asking them to apologize. I was walking in with facts. Whatever happened after that belonged to them. When we arrived, Sophie was already there. She was smiling. She hugged relatives. She accepted sympathy. Every few minutes, she said something about how difficult things had been. I just hope Claire is okay. I've tried to stay out of it. I don't want this to become another family problem. People looked at her with sympathy. Then the door opened again. Daniel walked in beside me. The room went quiet, because Sophie had told everyone he had left, and now he was standing beside his wife. But that wasn't the biggest surprise of the night. The biggest surprise was what happened when I asked Sophie to show everyone the photograph. Sophie stared at me. What photograph? The one you sent Daniel? Her expression changed for less than a second. Then she smiled. I don't know what you're talking about. Daniel took out his phone. I do. Several people looked at him. Sophie immediately said, Daniel, this is a family matter. He shook his head. You made it a family matter. My father looked uncomfortable. My mother stepped forward. Claire, please don't do this tonight. I looked at her. Why not? Nobody answered. I opened the photograph. People gathered around. There was Sophie beside Daniel at the restaurant, her shoulder against his. The image looked intimate. Someone whispered, Oh my God. Sophie crossed her arms. That proves nothing. I nodded. You're right. Then I opened the original photograph. Same restaurant, same moment. But this one showed the entire room. People were sitting around them. The table wasn't private. Daniel wasn't leaning toward Sophie. He was turned away. She had simply chosen the narrowest possible frame. The room became quiet. Sophie said, It was just a picture. Then why did you send it to my husband? She didn't answer. Why did you tell him he deserved someone who understood him? Still nothing. My mother tried to interrupt. Maybe everyone misunderstood. I looked at her. That's why I brought the messages. I showed the screenshot Sophie had sent. At the top was the message she hadn't intended us to see. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse. It showed that Sophie had been discussing what version of the story different family members should hear. My father leaned closer. Is that what I think it says? Sophie grabbed for an explanation. You're twisting it. I didn't argue. I simply showed the next message. Then another. Different relatives, different versions. Same goal. Make Claire look unstable. Make Daniel look unhappy. Make Sophie look concerned. That was when one of my aunts covered her mouth. I believed you, she whispered. Sophie looked at her. I was trying to help. I finally understood why the lie had worked. It wasn't built around one enormous falsehood. It was built from dozens of small suggestions. A worried phone call. A carefully chosen photograph. A vague comment. A sympathetic expression. By the time the story reached everyone, nobody remembered where it started. They only remembered that everyone else seemed to believe it. That is how a rumor becomes a family fact. I looked around the room. You don't have to believe me because I'm standing here. I paused. You can look at what was actually said. No shouting. No insults. Just evidence. For once, I didn't need to fight for the right to finish a sentence. But Sophie wasn't finished. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. You always get everything. The room went still. You always get the husband, the children, the good life. I stared at her. I never took those things from you. You didn't have to. Her voice broke. They always looked at you. And suddenly the lie made sense. This hadn't really been about Daniel. It had been about attention, about comparison, about making me fall so Sophie could finally feel taller. And I felt something I hadn't expected. Sadness. Not triumph. Sadness. Because no amount of evidence could give her the thing she thought I had stolen. Sophie started crying. My mother moved toward her immediately. She didn't mean it. Sophie pulled away. I did. That sentence silenced everyone. She looked at me. You always knew how to make them care about you. I almost laughed. By being the difficult one. She didn't answer. Instead, she said, Grandma loved you more. The words hit me harder than anything she'd said about Daniel. For years, I had wondered whether that was why she'd started the story at by Grandma's funeral. Maybe it wasn't about the photograph. Maybe it had always been about comparison. I looked at Sophie. Did you tell me Grandma was ashamed of me because you wanted me to believe it? She looked away. I don't know. You knew. My voice stayed calm. That seemed to bother her more than anger would have. Megan stood. I need to say something. She told everyone what she had seen 15 years earlier. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't accuse Sophie of things she couldn't prove. She simply described the moment before the photograph. Sophie approaching me. The private conversation. The phone already in her hand. Then my reaction. My mother looked at her. Is that true? Sophie said nothing. My father sat down. I watched him stare at the floor. For most of my life, he had avoided conflict by pretending not to notice it. That night, he finally had nowhere to look except at the facts. He turned to me. Claire, I should have asked you. It wasn't a full apology, but it was the first time he'd admitted that he had never asked. I nodded. Thank you. My mother wasn't ready. She kept saying Sophie was hurting. I looked at her. So was I. She became quiet. That was the moment I realized something. I had spent 15 years waiting for someone to choose me. My mother, my father, my relatives, anyone. But I didn't need that anymore. I didn't need my family to agree that I had been hurt. I didn't need them to declare me the good daughter and Sophie the bad one. I didn't even need Sophie to admit every detail. I needed to stop giving other people control over my sense of reality. I closed the folder. I brought all of this because I wanted you to know what happened. I looked around the room. But I didn't come here to make you choose between us. My mother looked at me. What do you want? I answered honestly. I want to stop being part of this story. Daniel stood beside me. Megan was still across the room. I felt strangely light. For years, I had thought the ultimate victory would be seeing Sophie exposed. But standing there, I realized exposure wasn't the victory. Freedom was. I didn't need to punish her. I didn't need to ruin her life. The truth had already done what it needed to do. It had separated what happened from what people had been told happened. I put my phone away. Then I turned toward the door. My mother called my name. Claire. I stopped. She looked like she wanted to say something. For once, I didn't rush to fill the silence. I waited. She finally whispered, I'm sorry this happened. Not I'm sorry I believed her. Not I'm sorry I didn't ask you. Just that. I nodded anyway. It wasn't enough. But I no longer needed it to be. I walked out of the house with Daniel beside me. Neither of us spoke until we reached the car. Then Daniel said, Are you okay? I thought about it. Yes. Not because everything was fixed. Because I wasn't confused anymore. The next morning, my mother called. Her first words were not an apology. You embarrassed your sister. I closed my eyes. The old pattern had returned almost immediately. I let her speak. She said the gathering had gone too far. She said Sophie was emotional. She said everyone needed to move forward. Finally, she said, Can't you just let this go? I answered quietly. I can let it go. I just can't pretend it didn't happen. She became silent. Then she said I was making things harder than they needed to be. I told her something I had never said before. Peace isn't the same thing as pretending. She didn't respond. I ended the call. That was the first boundary. There were others. I stopped explaining myself to relatives who had already chosen their version. When someone asked what happened, I said, There were lies about my marriage. The truth came out. I didn't send screenshots. I didn't write long messages. I didn't recruit people to my side. If someone wanted details, I told them they could ask me directly. Some did. Some apologized. Some didn't. A few still said Sophie had only made a mistake. I learned not to argue with those people. You can show someone the entire picture and they can still choose the part that makes them comfortable. That choice belongs to them. It doesn't have to become your burden. Daniel and I also had our own conversation. I asked him why he hadn't told me about Sophie's first messages. He looked ashamed. I thought ignoring her would protect you. I nodded. Sometimes silence protects the person causing the problem. He didn't defend himself. I understand now. That mattered. Because this wasn't just about my family. It was about learning that even well-intentioned silence can create space for someone else's version of the truth. A few weeks later, I heard that Sophie and her fiancé had postponed their wedding. I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell anyone I was glad. I wasn't. There was no satisfaction in watching someone else's plans collapse. My satisfaction was much quieter. People stopped treating me like I was unstable. My aunt apologized. My father called me. He said, I should have asked you years ago. I told him, yes, you should have. He accepted that. There was no dramatic reconciliation, but something had changed. I no longer felt like I needed to perform forgiveness just because someone finally felt uncomfortable. I could accept an apology without pretending the damage hadn't happened. My mother left another voicemail a few days later. She said we should put everything behind us. I listened. Then I deleted it. Not because I hated her, because I had finally learned that moving forward doesn't require carrying everyone with you. For most of my life, I had been afraid that setting a boundary meant losing my family. That day, I realized something else. Sometimes the family you are afraid to lose is the very thing keeping you from becoming yourself. And I was finally becoming someone I recognized. One Saturday morning, I opened the garage and saw an old folding chair sitting in the corner. I almost laughed. I'd forgotten about it. That chair had been at countless family gatherings. Whenever there weren't enough seats, I got it. Whenever Sophie wanted the comfortable chair, someone moved it for her. It was such a small thing. But suddenly I understood why seeing it bothered me. It represented a role I'd accepted without realizing it. I was always the one who adjusted. The one who made room. The one who swallowed disappointment. The one who sat quietly while someone else received the attention. I carried the chair outside. I put a small free sign on it. A neighbor took it that afternoon. I watched him drive away with it in the back of his truck. Then I stood in the empty garage. It felt ridiculous to feel emotional about a chair. But I did. Because sometimes healing doesn't arrive as a dramatic moment. Sometimes it's realizing you don't need the thing that represented your old life anymore. A few months after the family gathering, I found the original funeral photograph in a storage box. I almost threw it away. Instead, I studied it. For 15 years, I'd looked at that picture and seen what everyone had told me I was. Too emotional, too difficult, too sensitive. But this time I looked beyond the frame. The picture showed one moment. It didn't show what had been said before it. It didn't show what happened afterward. It didn't show who I had been for the years before Grandma died. It wasn't a biography. It was a photograph. And I realized I'd made the same mistake my family had. I'd allowed one captured moment to become the definition of an entire person. Me. I printed the full version and kept it. Not because I wanted to remember the pain. Because I wanted to remember the lesson. Look beyond the frame. Ask what happened before the moment you're being shown. Ask who benefits from the version you're being handed. And don't let someone else's description of you become your own voice. That lesson changed more than my relationship with my family. It changed my relationship with myself. I stopped asking my mother whether my feelings were reasonable. I stopped rewriting my memories to make other people comfortable. I stopped apologizing for noticing when something hurt. And I stopped thinking that being calm meant staying silent. If you've ever been called too sensitive, when you were simply trying to explain that something hurt you, I want to hear from you. You don't have to share your whole story. Just tell me you understand. Because I know there are people listening right now who have spent years questioning themselves because someone else kept changing the story. I know what that feels like. And if that is you, I hope you remember what took me years to learn. You are allowed to trust what you experienced. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to step away from people who keep demanding that you doubt yourself. And you don't have to become cruel to become strong. Sometimes the quietest decision is the one that changes your entire life. My family didn't suddenly become perfect. Sophie didn't wake up one morning and become a different person. My mother never gave me the grand apology I had once imagined. Life rarely gives us endings that clean. But something much more important happened. I stopped waiting for one. I stopped believing my healing depended on someone else finally admitting they had been wrong. My relationship with Sophie became distant. Not hateful, not dramatic. Just distant. And for the first time, I was okay with that. My father and I slowly rebuilt something quieter. He started asking questions instead of making assumptions. That mattered. My mother and I spoke less. When we did talk, I kept boundaries that I had never been able to keep before. If she criticized me, I ended the conversation. If she tried to pull me into another argument about Sophie, I refused. If she wanted peace without honesty, I declined. I didn't punish her. I simply stopped participating. That was my quiet payback. Not destroying my sister. Not embarrassing my parents. Not making everyone regret what they had done. It was refusing to carry their version of me any longer. Daniel and I stayed together. Our marriage wasn't magically stronger because of what happened. We still had difficult conversations. We still disagreed. But there was something different between us. We understood how dangerous silence could be. And we promised each other that protecting the peace would never again mean hiding the truth. Sometimes I think about that morning at 6:30. My mother laughing. My father telling me not to embarrass myself. Both of them believing my husband had left. And Daniel sitting beside me listening. At the time, I thought that phone call was the beginning of the worst chapter of my life. Now I see it differently. It was the morning I finally stopped asking other people to tell me who I was. My family had spent years telling a story about me. The difficult daughter, the sensitive sister, the woman who overreacted, the person who caused tension. For a long time I fought that story. Then I realized something. I didn't have to replace their story with a better one. I just had to stop living inside theirs. So I closed the box containing that old photograph. I put it back on the shelf. It wasn't a wound anymore. It was evidence. Evidence that one picture can be misleading. Evidence that one person's version isn't automatically the truth. Evidence that silence can protect a lie. And evidence that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop explaining yourself to people who have already decided not to listen. My name is Claire. For most of my life, I thought being loved meant being understood by my family. Now I know better. Sometimes being free means accepting that certain people may never understand you, and still choosing yourself. I didn't win because Sophie lost. I won because I stopped measuring my life by whether she, my mother, or anyone else finally saw my worth. I made my own table. I chose who belonged around it. And I stopped sitting in the folding chair waiting for permission to take up space. That was my revenge. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It didn't destroy anyone. It simply gave me my life back. And honestly, after all those years, that was more than enough.